Well, hello, this is Adam, and welcome to Rare Classic Cars. If you haven't watched us before, we like to talk about different topics about cars that people have forgotten over the years, and also various automotive topics. So today we're going to talk about one of those fundamental automotive topics, and that is vehicle pricing. How do automakers price their vehicles? Now, this may be a bit of a mystery to some of you, but I can say that I led vehicle pricing for General Motors in Canada for a number of years. So I have some unique insights, and I'll try to just boil it down for each of you so that you can better understand what automakers think about. This is not a comprehensive review, but it's just meant to give you a flavor of what automakers think about when they're pricing cars. So the first thing really, when you think about vehicle pricing is, in the auto companies, there's this whole planning activity that goes on to determine over a horizon period, which may stretch well beyond 15 years in some cases, but typically it'll be 10, 15 years plus, and they'll try to discern what are the volumes associated with each vehicle line over that horizon period. And what's the purpose of that? Well, remember, in these auto companies, you have to fill assembly plants, you have to plan labor, you have to plan programs well in advance because the vehicle development cycle takes 3 or 4 years plus. So you have to start back with a philosophy on how many units are you going to produce in any given year. And then that starts informing your projections and the basis for your decisions that you make about vehicle pricing as well as other things. So really, the process starts with program planning, which if you're somebody outside of the financial discipline or outside of program planning, let's say you're an engineer or in particular you're a designer, some people really don't like this planning function, but it serves a purpose and you have to plan over the long term. Otherwise, how do you know where you're going to build assembly plants, what's optimal? And imagine the data that has to exist in this. Imagine just a massive spreadsheet or system with all the different vehicle lines, all the geographies in which they're going to sell, and then populated by number of units that are going to be produced. And in some cases, there may be more than one assembly plant for a given car. So this whole cube has to be filled out with information. And that's kind of the starting point for some of this. Then you get to a specific vehicle program, and you may have a vehicle that's already in the market. So let's talk about what this looks like when there's already a vehicle in the market, because it's hard. Most companies aren't entering new niches right now. Yeah, some of the sports car companies are building SUVs and things like that, but most of the niches have been filled by a lot of the companies. So you then have to figure out who your competitive set is. So if you're a Toyota RAV4, you've got the Honda CR-V, the Chevrolet Equinox. You have a suite of competitors, the Ford Escape. In that group, you have to figure out who the competitors are. And then you have to figure out what are the price points at which they're selling from an MSRP standpoint by trim. What are the options that come on each trim standard? So imagine, you want to develop a new SUV. You got to figure out who's in the competitive set. Let's say that it's the compact SUV segment. So Equinox, RAV4, CR-V, Escape. I mean, I could go on and on. That's a pretty crowded segment with Hyundai, Kia, offerings too. So you select the competitive set, figure out what equipment is standard by trim, and you actually assign then values to each piece of equipment that comes on the vehicles. So as an example, if some cars have automatic power down window switches on the driver and passenger door but don't have it on the rear, or they have automatic up on some of the switches, or it comes with Bluetooth on some trims, or they have bigger or smaller touchscreen displays, or they may even not be touchscreen displays. Maybe you actually have to interface with a little wheel to get the display to do anything. Or it has power seats, or it has automatic climate control, or a special radio, let's say more than 4 speakers or something like that. You have to basically figure out all the standard content, and then there's value assigned to all the standard content, and you must compare that to where your vehicle is. So let's just say, as an example, you're proposing a vehicle that has express down windows but not express up. In some cases, each express down window is worth about $50 as an example. And I can say, interestingly, at some auto companies, the express up is worth $25. Why the Express down is worth 50 per window and the Express up is worth 25 per window? Well, that's what the market research has suggested. Now, everybody has a little bit different opinion. There is no firm rules for how much the customer is willing to pay for each of these options beyond the research that the automakers do. But you'll find some of them, like GM, for instance, it's rare that you get Express up on all the windows, in part because they don't value it or they believe customers value it as much as other automakers. So you go through and you price out all the content, you determine what content you're going to have on your vehicle, and then you compare. And you see what is the like-for-like comparison across the vehicle you're proposing and the competitive set from an MSRP standpoint to start. And you have to think about what's the philosophy for this vehicle as well. So are you going to come in and have an MSRP that undercuts everybody but have lower content? Are you going to come in with a comparable MSRP and perhaps have the same content? Got to have good brand equity, especially in the compact SUV segment, to do that. It's hard to basically knock some of these juggernauts off. Or you're going to have a little bit more content, even things like a longer warranty period would count in this. You have more content versus the competitive set and offer more value, perceived value. So you have to have a philosophy for how you're going to enter the market and achieve or exceed the planning volumes that we talked about before. So that's really this, imagine just a big spreadsheet with all this different content by trim, by vehicle, for the proposed vehicle and the competitive set. That's how it works. And then you basically spits out what an MSRP really should be for this car based on the proposal that you have, and then comparing that on a like-for-like basis to the competitive set. Then you have to understand, well, what's the philosophy for the incentives by program? So some automakers, and this is a really strange world right now because nobody has any cars to sell. So these comments are going to apply in a world where car supply is plentiful. Totally different story today where there's a lot more customers than there are cars to sell. Nonetheless, you then have to determine the incentive load on the vehicle. And the incentives are a function. So when you go to a dealer to buy a car, there are manufacturer to dealer incentives. And then there are also just incentives that the dealers will put in to get the customer to come to their dealership. It's not totally the dealer's incentive pool. It's not the manufacturer's incentive pool. When you're modeling, you're just going to model whatever the manufacturer's incentives are because that's what you can control directly. The dealer themselves has to determine how much they're going to put in the deal. So you determine the incentive load, and then that kind of gets you to what the net price is. And what's interesting about this is it's a very mechanical equation. Like I just said, you think about what are the planning volumes over the time? What does the proposed vehicle look like? What kind of content does it have? What is the philosophy for the vehicle? What content do the competitors have? What is a like-for-like pricing comparison across the various trims? And you have to figure out how you're going to position the trims versus one another. You don't want too big of a gap. Like as an example, if you have a base, a mid-level, and a premium trim, you have to make sure that you don't have too big of a gap between the base trim pricing and the mid-level and the premium. In some cases, you actually want to shrink the distance between those so that you incentivize the buyer to trade up. If you make that gap too big, then no buyer is going to want to make that gap, trade up for that gap. So it's an art really of understanding what content you have in the vehicle and then positioning it such that the customer will perceive enough value, hopefully, to make the leap to the next level up trim, which then will get you more profitability. Base cars don't really make, in general, much profitability. In fact, they may lose money. It's really as you get to the upper end trims that more and more money can be made, especially when you're talking about compact crossovers or cars. SUVs and trucks tend to make good money. But on the compact car segment or the crossover segment, it's an art, again, to make sure that the customer wants to trade up. And it's beyond the customer. It's that the dealer can actually speak to the value proposition and convince the customer to trade up as well. And herein lies a really interesting wrinkle that I think a lot of people outside the industry don't understand. And that is so much of this vehicle pricing and the success of the pricing is dependent upon, yes, of course, what the OE does. It's also dependent upon the dealers. And even if it's a great car, it's so dependent upon dealer psyche and whether or not they think that the car is a good deal, that they'll put their money behind it, that they'll tell their salespeople to pick up the phone and call customers and incentivize them appropriately to do so. That's really what makes or breaks a lot of successful vehicles, especially in this day and age where many dealers have multiple brands in their showroom, even cross OEM brands. You may see, as an example, Buick, GMC, Hyundai, Kia, all on the same dealer lot and property. Or certainly dealer principals own a lot of different brands now, versus in the past, you might have a dealer principal who owned an Oldsmobile dealership or a Pontiac dealership. That's all changed. The dealer network and the has really gotten gobbled up by a lot of mega dealers that own many, many, many dealers across, sometimes across the U.S., not even just within a metropolitan area. There are a lot of dealers that own swaths of dealerships across the entire United States. That's just how it operates today. So dealer psyche is hugely important. And what does that mean? Let's just say that you do all this work and you believe that you've competitively priced the vehicle. You've got all the great equipment. You're going to get ready to introduce it. You've convinced yourself you've got a good philosophy for pricing. Well, if the dealer doesn't believe that, even if it is rationally correct, it doesn't matter. They won't sell it. And all these dealers talk to one another as well, especially the big dealers. They all know one another. So what do I mean by that? I can tell you, from having worked in the industry, in some cases, dealers will always think about, well, what did I sell the vehicle at, in the past? And what does this new vehicle mean? On a cash deal, on a finance deal, and on a lease, and across the different terms. You can obviously lease for different term lengths. You can finance over different term lengths. So what they do is they look at the payment points that the customers have to pay on the current vehicle and compare them to what the new proposed vehicle is. And in some cases, you have to be very careful, because if you take the old vehicle and as you're trying to clear out an old model, you start debasing the price and it goes down and down and down. You create too big of a gap from a payment point perspective when the new vehicle comes out. So imagine, as an example, you took, let's say, a compact crossover SUV where the average payment point was $249 a month. And as you're trying to clear out that vehicle and it becomes old, the $249 becomes $229, becomes $199, it becomes $179 a month in some deals, on the volume deals. And then you introduce a new compact crossover and you want to sell it now. You're saying, well, it's a new vehicle. Years have gone by since the old one was introduced. That one was introduced at $249. Let's make this one $289 or $299 a month. Well, $299 a month doesn't sound all that bad versus the $249 where the old one started. But it sounds really tough versus where the last one ended, let's say at $179 a month. That's a big gap. And often what happens is the dealers will say, I can't make that gap work. How am I going to tell that customer who comes in with that $179 a month payment to make the $299 a month payment? And they have a point. So it's really this art form as the course of the model years go on to balance the sales and making sure dealers are incentivized to sell the cars, and also making sure you don't go too deep so that when the new model comes out, you have too big of a gap that you can never reset the baseline. You can never get it back up that high. The same applies to model years, by the way. So it's really tough within or across the model years to make sure there's a couple things to balance. You have to make sure that dealers really sell down most of their inventory of the old model year in time before the new model year starts shipping and they receive it, because the old model year vehicles become sale-proof. Everybody wants the new one. And if you don't allow them to clear out of that old model year fast enough, well, then you have trouble when the new one comes in and they want more money to sell it. And, if you lean in too hard on that old model year to get it cleared out, now the gap is too big to the next model year. And they complain about that. It really is challenging. And you have to remember, this all goes on. I think people think, well, gosh, these auto companies are stupid. Why don't they put more content in cars? Why do they make the decisions they make? This is not an easy business. In good times, auto companies are making 5 to 10 cents before taxes on every dollar of sales. A nickel to a dime on every dollar before taxes. That's the profit. And that's before they pay the federal government on the taxes. That's the profit they make. So you mess up little elements of this equation along the way. You put too much content in the car. You put too little content in the car. You go too deep on the incentives. You go too light on the incentives and the cars don't sell. And you really just end up squishing that 5 to 10 cents that in good times the car companies are able to make, and you squeeze it out of the equation and then you make no money. And that's why this is such a challenging industry. It's so cyclical. The macroeconomic factors, like right now, who would have ever anticipated chip shortages, product shortages, commodity shortages, war in Russia, the city of Shanghai shutting down in 2 pieces right now, east and west. Imagine what it's like to get parts out of these places in the world. And sometimes this is the only places you can get parts. Russia produces a lot of the gases that are used for etching silicon wafers. So, and so does the Ukraine, by the way. So what are you going to do? Yeah, that's the place that makes them. And it's not like every place in the world is resource rich and has these gases that are needed. You have to get them where they're based from. So when you have all these different factors, that in particular, the environment we're in, slowing down vehicle production, when you slow down vehicle production, you slow down the revenues that the companies can make. When you slow down the revenues companies can make, when you have big staffs across manufacturing plants and in the central office, whether that's marketing or public relations, government relations, engineering, research and development, when you start slowing the revenue down, the portion of those costs that can be basically associated with each car has to go up. I've got a big pool of fixed costs that don't really change all that much. And as my vehicle production goes down, that means that each car has to bear the burden of more of those fixed costs, which further creates issues associated with profitability. So this is a really tough equation. You're trying to balance getting the right volumes, getting to the point where you get those volumes because you need it to thin the fixed costs over the appropriate amount of vehicles. At the same time, you can't overdo it on the volume because then you're putting more incentives on the hood of the car and you decrease profitability that way. And if you don't quite have the pricing of the vehicles right, then the dealers they're not in the mental game, nor are your own salespeople. And let me tell you, that is the psyche of dealers and your own salespeople is one of the biggest factors in determining the success of cars. And people often don't think about that. And it's huge. It's huge not only in the auto industry, it's huge everywhere that you have sales teams. So it's probably tougher in the auto industry because, as I said, it's only 5 to 10 cents on every dollar of revenue that you have left over. That's a very thin margin for error. I mean, think about the decisions that you make in your household. What if you only could make 5 to 10% of the decisions incorrectly? I make a lot of wrong decisions, certainly more than 5 to 10%. So it's a complex business. But I thought I'd at least give you a little bit of insight. Let me know if you like these types of chats on the industry insider information, and I'm happy to talk about it more. I think it's fascinating. The business is just a fascinating business, obviously evolving at a rapid pace. You have all the things that I just talked about now, and then you have this electric vehicle transition and all the costs associated with that. You have so many more competitors today than you did even, 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. So it's a really, really tough space and a really interesting one. And I think that's what makes it fascinating to talk about. Hope you enjoyed this porch chat on vehicle pricing and some of the dynamics in the auto industry. Thanks again for watching, and until next time, take care. Thanks for watching this video with some insight on how automakers price vehicles. Hope you enjoyed. Please like and comment as that helps the YouTube algorithm serve this video up to more people like you. Also, be sure to check out the video thumbnails at the bottom left and right for YouTube suggestions. And subscribe if you haven't already by clicking the circular icon of the 67 Buick Riviera at the top left. Then hit the bell to ensure you're notified of all my future videos. Once again, thank you for watching and take care.